I'm going to just start off with a quick question to each of this morning's speakers to get us going, and then we'll have a whole discussion based on the questions that are going to come in from our audience. So Yuan, you really gave us an extremely entertaining and provocative talk, and I love that you really focused on the false binary. I think that was really important because that is a way that people, both Americans or Westerners and Chinese, talk about China so much as a sort of democracy versus autocracy argument, as opposed to remembering that there are aspects of each. There was one thing that you mentioned in your presentation that you sort of put a pin in, and you said we can come back to this. We haven't yet come back to it, so I'm going to bring us back to it, which is the question of the reform era, by your definition, ending in 2012, and how under Xi Jinping there has been backsliding from this reform. We now have this potential president for life. So I'd like to hear from you about this bureaucratic reform that you've talked about that has not yet taken on political reform. Are we likely to see continued backsliding and movement away from a more democratic China now under Xi Jinping?
Well, I think the general consensus and the signs that we see is that political freedoms, the space for political freedom is shrinking in China. And I feel that even as a researcher, it's so much more difficult to do research in China after 2013. So this is worrying. I also sometimes hear worrying accounts from colleagues in China, including in universities, restrictions about what can be taught, restrictions about spreading so-called foreign ideas. So all of this is worrying. And I think the question that you raise is a question for research, which is that as this space for political freedom is closing, what is happening on the bureaucratic front? And on that front, I would like to remain a little open-minded, because I think that it is possible in this context that even as the space for political freedom is shrinking, I believe that the Chinese Communist Party is still experimenting with bureaucratic reforms and is still allowing some pockets of flexibility. And that we will have to see. Just to give an example, one of my recent research looks at, we look at all of the directives that come out of Beijing and look at how much flexibility is accorded by these directives. And I was very surprised that in the Xi era, the amount of flexibility or ambiguity in the directions have actually increased. So I think this is, again, hard to read China because it's always a very gated picture, where you see suppression and repression on the one hand, and then on the bureaucratic front, you might see some pockets of flexibility that we don't normally notice. But it's an open question, and we still have to study and see what happens.
All right. Yasheng Huang, I want to ask you, one of the underlying ideas that you discussed in your talk was this notion that US engagement with China has in fact worked, that there's not enough credit given to this concept of engagement working, but that its fruits are not evident in the short term. And I want to challenge that a little bit and ask you to give us the evidence. Where's the proof that that engagement is working? Because critics of US-China policy point not just to the Obama administration, but to every administration before, saying that in our interest to engage China, we haven't been tough enough with them on a number of fronts. And I've even heard people who are not scholars who are not fans of Trump saying, wrong man, but right message to be holding China more accountable. What is your response to that?
Okay, so I think he's wrong for everything, but that's it. And I think we need to distinguish between tough on China and take the appropriate measures as opposed to just being tough for the sake of being tough. There are other ways of being tough with China, which I think will be more productive. Let me give an example. Alibaba is able to operate its big data centers in the United States, 100% owned by Alibaba. The United States companies are not able to do that in China, except under a minority equity arrangement with the Chinese company, and that's clearly lack of equal treatment. The other example is that in the United States, we can access Baidu, the Chinese search engine, and in China, people are not able to access Google. I would argue a far more productive approach is to deal with China on those specific issues, case by case. George mentioned Huawei's example. I think the British government got the balance right? Which is that you say Huawei has all these sort of backdoor way of storing data and working for the Chinese government. Show me the evidence. So far, I don't think there has been any evidence produced to show that. Even though I'm an MIT professor, I'm not on the engineering side of MIT, so I don't know the technology. But I have heard that this idea that you can plant a chip, and it's extremely difficult to do, right? So I think this case-by-case approach is better than this existential approach, right? Writing off the whole country altogether. Let's pick an argument that says that China has been bad to the United States. It is really important to emphasize that even though the US GDP growth has been slow in comparison with China, we need to think about what is known as a counterfactual scenario. Suppose China never rose, right? Would the US GDP growth be 1.2%, 1.3%, 1.5%? I would say probably it's going to be lower, even lower than that, right? And so look at the rise of China enabling US companies to organize their production globally more efficiently across the supply chain management. Look at the Chinese products coming into this country, dramatically lowering the cost of living for the Americans, right? So that has been hugely beneficial to the US economy. Without the rise of China, you may still retain a larger share of the GDP, but in terms of the absolute level of the GDP, you may not actually experience the gains that you would actually. So I care about actually the absolute rather than the relative decline, because that's more meaningful to people living in the United States. On the question about whether or not the engagement has failed, I said in my remarks, I think it's too much to expect engagement to affect politics in such a short order, right? If you go back to Ricardo, Adam Smith, they don't really talk about free trade bringing about democracy. They talk about free trade bringing about efficiency and things like that. That's the appropriate level of the expectations. The survey research shows that free trade, foreign direct investment, globalization incubate liberal values, right? That's good for China in the long run. But that long run is probably too long for you.
All right, well, let's hope we all in these various theaters watching today live to see that day.
I don't mean the age thing. It just means that your expectations are...
Yeah. All right. George Yip, I really enjoyed hearing how in a relatively short period of time, your analysis of how China has moved from imitation to innovation. And I have to say that even just 20 years ago living in China, the #1 focus for at least American correspondents was IP. There's so much copying everywhere. And you're absolutely right to show how innovation is now, has leapfrogged over that imitation. But I do want to ask you, is that innovation culture in China sustainable? And specifically, is the Chinese education system set up in such a way to encourage innovation in the long term?
I mean, the Chinese education system has some disadvantages because of the rote learning of the Chinese language, the hierarchical approach between the professors and the students. However, we have to remember that an important part of the Chinese innovation ecosystem now is ethnic Chinese who've got their PhDs from the West. So they are plenty innovative. And China's deliberately attracting them back, has official programs, the 1,000 Talents program, the 10,000 Talents program, tax incentives and honors to bring these people back, and then they give them a much bigger pyramid than they would have had before. So it's not just the locally trained people.
what are the overall numbers on brain drain and reverse brain drain? Because I would guess there's still more Chinese grad students coming here, or Chinese students overall, tertiary students coming here than American students going to China.
Oh yes, of course. But the important point is that there are tens of thousands of students coming here. But if you look in the PhD programs in the West, in the science subjects, they're full of ethnic Chinese. And some of them are going back. That's the important thing. Some of them are going back. The other interesting one is that the Chinese government is now paying Duke University to run a program to train Chinese lecturers to teach in a way to make Chinese students more creative. So once again, China is paying the USA to make China more competitive.
Fascinating. All right, that's great to get us going. So I hope that seeded some thoughts for all of you, some questions. I'd like to ask you, if you can, to direct your question, if there's a specific person on the panel who you want to answer it, because it'll be hard to have every panelist answer every question. So I'm looking for my spotter here. Okay, yes, we have a question right here in the front row. Yes, thanks.
Naively, maybe a month or so ago.
Oh, please introduce yourself, remember.
Bob Jackson, Rockport. I maybe naively thought that Xi could do a lot of things approximately on his own, maybe bring along a few of his lieutenants as he made decisions. And then I heard this morning that the bureaucracy has a lot to say about this. So my question is, with the proposition that's been advanced on trade, is it really possible for Xi to make these decisions, or will the bureaucracy really drag it down and go on forever?
Thank you. Is there someone who feels particularly able to answer that? UN?
I'm happy to take a step,
okay.
since I brought in the sleep-inducing topic there. I'm very glad that people are willing
bureaucracy.
To talk about
Yes.
now. Yeah.
I don't think I've ever been to a conference where bureaucracy was a major topic of interest.
That's a great question, and I think that not only in the trade realm, but in another area of my research is I'm looking also at the Belt and Road, and this is a very good example where. When people see the Belt and Road, having problems, having debt risk, they attribute the problems to some kind of strategic intention on the part of leaders, right? So they imagine this to be some kind of conspiracy theory where the leaders deliberately wanted these Belt and Road projects to fail so that they can take over the assets. There is perhaps, in some cases, some strategic intentions going on, but my argument is if you understand Chinese bureaucracy, that's not really how things work. How really things work is that Xi might have had this grand vision, we're going to have the Belt and Road, we're going to connect 60 countries, and then he doesn't say anything much more about how we're going to do it. He leaves it to the bureaucracy. And I'll give an example of the extent of this delegation of duties, which is quite stunning, because the Belt and Road is a massive project, and I can't exactly remember the numbers, but I know the amount of money that the Chinese government is spending is 7 times that of the Marshall Plan. So it is a very massive project.
But is that inflation-adjusted dollars?
Perhaps yes. Not. I'm not too sure. But we can take the point that it's
I just asked if it was inflation-adjusted
dollars.
Yes,
it is, but it's 12 times.
Oh, okay. So it's massive, right? It's massive spending. But if you go to the Belt and Road official website, you can actually find the central government's official action plan for the Belt and Road. You can find it. It's in Chinese. And it's printed in large font in 7 pages. That's it. It's very short for what is a very, very grand project. And it has the instructions of this document include things like go where the demand is. And that's like, or work together and then find our vision, or something like that. And it's very typical in Chinese where the leader has some grand vision. He is very powerful indeed, but then this implementation of the vision is then delegated to the vast bureaucracy. And the vast bureaucracy has interests and calculations of its own. And it's often very short-term and narrow. It's about pleasing my boss, or what am I going to put on my annual evaluation? How am I going to make myself look good? How do I benefit in this process of doing this particular project? And it's this aggregation of narrow short-term interests that can actually have very far-reaching practical consequences, as we see in the Belt and Road. So I think this element of understanding Chinese bureaucratic politics, how important it is, and how the interests and the actions of the bureaucracy may be at a large gap from what the leadership intended, it's quite missing from our understanding of China.
Yeah. Just to support that point, it may surprise you to know that Chinese are not actually that obedient. And in fact, there's a Chinese saying, the mountain is high and the emperor is far away. So unless you monitor them very closely, they're not going to follow the central dictates. And the challenge in China now is realigning the key performance indicators. And for example, take the example of pollution. You'd think they can wave a wand and stop pollution. But for the last 40 years, the key performance indicator for the local officials is grow GDP. So long as that's the key performance indicator, they're going to ignore pollution. And we all know from teaching business how hard it is to change the KPIs in an organization.
All right, thank you. We have a question up here in the balcony.
Hi, Hope I from the University of Maine School of Policy and International Affairs. My question is for Dr. Ong, and I want to ask, do you think that China can come back to the flexibility you mentioned under Xi Jinping, or do you think it'll take a new leader to reinvigorate the reforms and bring about a new reform period, as seen in Deng Xiaoping's leadership?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question, by the way. And I can only say that my hope is that they will maintain the flexibility. But that is only a hope because, as I mentioned in my remarks, and Professor Huang made a similar point, I think the Chinese elites, a lot of the Chinese leadership and the elites advising them are under the impression or subscribing to the myth that China made it through top-down control, authoritarian governance, infrastructure investments, and they set aside a lot of the real historical facts of what really made China dynamic. And so I can only say that I wish that they will continue on the path of flexibility and adaptability, because that is highly correlated with democratic liberal values. But at this point, I'm not sure that I could be optimistic about that.
I'm getting the signal that we have a question from one of our remote locations. So let's put that up on the screen. Sophie Lawrence from Cambridge, Massachusetts, who's at the Portland site, says, in which ways has China successfully or unsuccessfully addressed economic inequality? This is something that we touched on last night in Martin's presentation. Do you want to give a quick stab at it, Martin?
Yeah, well, I think I probably had a good go at it last night, but I'll say something briefly. I mean, I think this is an area where, if you just look at the Gini coefficient for China, China's been unsuccessful in relationship to trying to curb the growth of inequality in China. But as I explained last night, it's a complicated question because the basic growth of inequality in China has been spatial. It's been because the concentration in Deng Xiaoping's strategy was to develop, first of all, the coastal regions, above all Guangdong province initially, and then the eastern coastal region, the Yangtze Delta, Shanghai, and so on. And then moving to the central region, Sichuan, Chongqing, Chengdu, and so on, and latterly the western region, which is the most difficult of all and is also very underpopulated. And basically what's happened is the inequalities between these three regions has been greatly stretched. Now, it's not quite as simple as that now, because what's been happening is, for example, in the last 2 or 3, 4 years, Chongqing, which is a huge city and a province in its own right, has been the fastest growing province in China, but still the fact of the matter is that there's this very stretched pattern of inequality. Now, I was arguing last night that in the short term at least, this is probably not so serious because it's been a developmental characteristic of China, but the growth of inequality within, for example, the big cities, the tier 1 cities, the tier 2 cities, tier 1 cities is very clear. And the failure so far of the government to move seriously on the question of hukou rights for migrant workers
PUCO again being the permit that allows you to live somewhere and gives you the right to housing and education.
In China, all the everyone is registered in a particular area, and in that area, their family, their kids, and so on, they have the hospital rights, the kids' education, and so on. So if you come from 100 miles or 500 miles from Beijing and you're in Beijing as a migrant worker, you don't have any rights to use the hospitals or to use the schools. You have to go back to your home. And these are sources, I think, of growing inequality. And in my view, this is going to be a really serious problem for China unless it's tackled. Now, to give China its due, actually, it's been pretty good at tackling these kind of problems. But, you know, as we've seen in the West, actually, seen in America, seen in my own country, inequality seems to go quiet. In the heyday of neoliberalism, inequality almost slipped off the bottom of the agenda. No one talked about it. But it was there, festering, and it exploded. And it's exploded and transformed both American politics and UK politics, and has basically upended the neoliberal project.
So Yasheng, I want you to respond to this too, because of course, within these tier 1 cities, any of us can go to Shanghai, Beijing, and we see billionaires, literal billionaires, living in massive mansions that look just like the White House or penthouses next to extremely poor areas, not just migrant workers, but even poor people there. So how do you regard the way that the Chinese government is trying to deal with inequality within cities?
Yeah, so those sources of inequality are actually relatively minor contributors to overall inequality. So billionaires and living in mansions and all of that. The major source of Chinese inequality is not within or among individuals. It's really among regions, and in particular between urban areas and the rural areas. And going back to this idea of flexibility, it's pretty good economic evidence to show that when Chinese economy was most flexible, the inequality at least didn't get worse at the same level of economic growth, right? So that's a careful statement, right? So I'm not saying inequality got better, and it didn't get worse when in the 1980s, when you had more flexibility in economic policy. The areas in the 1980s, that was when politically China was most liberal. Arguably economically, it was also quite liberal, especially in the financial sector. This is when the rural entrepreneurs really began to grow their businesses and compete with the state-owned enterprises, compete with the urban centers of economic gravity. What you see in the 1980s is that Gini coefficient actually maintained the same level, while the GDP growth was as good as the later 3 decades.
Do you want to give a very brief description of what the Gini coefficient is, since I assume that not everyone in our audience is necessarily
just a measure of inequality. So you could say it's a Gini coefficient, which is going from 0 to 1, 1 being most unequal. So China now is China in the 1980s, we're talking about 0.35, 37, something like that.
Very low Gini coefficient, meaning everybody was poor.
Yeah. So. Okay, so that's a separate, that's another measurement issue. So there's an idea that yes, communist era in the 1960s and 70s, it had excellent Gini performance because everybody was equally poor, right? And in the 1980s, though, there was massive economic growth, whereas the Gini coefficient was, say, 0.35, 0.37. Now we're talking about 0.47, 0.48, something like that, maybe a slight improvement as compared with 10 years ago. This is American level now, right? And so that's one. So
comparable to income inequality in the US.
And actually, in reality, it's worse than the United States. Because in the United States, we distinguish between what is known as pre-transfer Gini and post-transfer Gini. Even though US it doesn't have a big welfare state, to the extent its social protection programs work, it has worked to reduce the Gini. Whereas China, being a socialist country, ironically, doesn't have any social protection program. So essentially the post-Gini, pre-transfer Gini and post-transfer Gini are identical.
The same in China.
It's all 0.4 something.
Okay, interesting that it's at the same levels of the US now. We have a question right here, sir.
Hi, this is C.V. Ramachandran, Old Greenwich, Connecticut. This is a question for Dr. Yip. First of all, thanks a lot for that presentation and invitation to innovation. Here's my question to you. I was at the Beijing Auto Show last year, okay, electric vehicles. And there were 350 startups in the electric vehicle business. And we know this story does not end well for most of them. We've seen it in the solar panel industry. So my question to you is, how does the economic and social system within China support 90% of these startups failing? And how does the economic system sustain that?
Well, I mean, that is the Chinese system. You know, it is huge amount of free competition, and then there are a small number of survivors. That's why I referred to, you know, the Colosseum of competition. Now, I think, you know, there are similar numbers in the West as well. We're just not aware of them. And the point is that these entrepreneurs then, they go and try something else. So, for example, the company Geely that bought Volvo, when Li Shufu first started the company making cars, he did not have an official license to make cars. He made cars illegally, right? But he was protected by the local government. And finally, when he succeeded, he then got the national government to give him a national license. So that's part of the Chinese system. Also, these failures are pretty small scale, right? So it's not a disaster for the country, but that is why they become so competitive, and the ones that succeed then become world beaters. So, you know, one of the key ones is called BYD. Its name is actually in English, Build Your Dream. Right? So I've been to the headquarters in southern China. So look out for that. They're going to start exporting their cars pretty soon.
All right, we have a question right here.
Thank you. Kate Taylor from North Haven. And my question is for Professor Huang or anybody. Looking at the global sustainability, intuitively, in a perfect world, China and the United States would collaborate as opposed to look at each other as competitive threats or some sort of combination. And my question is, do you see more and better areas for this? Is this happening, and what are those? And sorry, I can't help myself, but the One Belt, One Road budget is, last I heard, over $3 trillion US. Thank you.
Yeah. So quickly on One Belt, One Road, and then on the central point of your question. The reason why One Belt, One Road is so large, larger than Marshall Plan, is because Marshall Plan worked with countries that were temporarily devastated by the war, but they still retained capabilities and know-how and the institutions that would normally promote economic growth. So you actually don't need to invest that much money to make them grow again. If you look at the One Belt, One Road, the money goes to, I don't know how to put it, basket countries, basically. It's seriously, I mean, these have high risk ratings, and for years and years they couldn't grow. There are no complementary institutions supporting growth. You are throwing big capital in the middle of nowhere. I hope it does something, but I'm not going to bet on it, right? So on your US-China collaboration, this is really a very important issue. So if I can talk a little bit about my own university, MIT, 40% of the faculty at MIT are foreign-born, 40%. And of that, the largest contingent is born in China. The graduate students even have a higher proportion of foreign-born, higher proportion of Chinese-born. If you deprive US research institutions of the ability to source students from China, source faculty from China, I don't matter because I don't really teach this science stuff, right? They can deny me a visa and the US won't suffer. But if...
Don't say that too loudly.
It may benefit, it may benefit. Yeah, so if you stop the flows of human capital from China, the first casualty is going to be the United States.
Isn't that already happening with H-1B visas and with certain, I mean, I'm told by Chinese professors in this country that it's harder for them to get grad students and it's harder for them to place their grad students in jobs now.
In the campaign, what Trump said is that he is going to go back to the H-1B, this is a work visa, H-1B level to the 1970s. If you go back to the 1970s, that means it's going to be cut by half.
And these are the visas that get people into Silicon Valley.
Absolutely.
These are the visas that are like the smart people, professional visa.
Absolutely, right? So you are hurting yourself first, right? So how do you get these talents? I mean, unless the United States does something else, which is they pay Wall Street lower, then they can recruit American talents into science and technology, right? So maybe that's another solution, right? Because basically, right, so look, if you look at what happened in the US after the Cold War, if you look at what the physics graduates went, they went to Wall Street, right? Because there was a collapse of physics research. It was great that the Chinese came. It was great that the Indians came. It was great that the Russians came to make up for that deficit as a result of the collapse of the research funding. So the other harm that Trump is doing to the US, and by the way, this is not being talked about. We're talking about farmers and all of that. The fundamental harm to the United States is undermining the US research capabilities. If you look at the early stage funding of entrepreneurial projects, startup projects, the US VC basically invests in two sectors.
Venture capitalists, yeah.
Venture capital, life science and software. Anywhere in between receives little attention from the US venture capitalists. It is the Chinese who are investing across the board in material science and hardware, manufacturing, and all of that, right? So essentially, by stopping Chinese from doing these things, you are depriving capital to US entrepreneurs who work in this space, right? So we need to be very clear about the harm that this current administration is inflicting on the United States. You know, spies and espionage, for me, that's a law and order issue. That's not a across-the-board foreign policy issue. By the way, the two Chinese scientists, Chinese-born scientists who have been charged with espionage, each one of these two cases was thrown out by the court for utter lack of evidence, right? FBI destroyed their career. University of Temple physics professor, another researcher in a government lab was fired, went to the court. The court threw out the case because the case was so weak, but it destroyed the career and reputation of these two Chinese-born scientists, right? And by the way, those two cases happened under Obama administration, right? So, and now I think it's even getting worse. I'm worried about China, but I'm also worried about the United States.
Yes, Martin.
Yeah, just a couple of things. Belt and Road, I just wanted to correct a widespread impression, which is that it was Xi Jinping's project. It was not Xi Jinping's idea. The idea was born in a conference in Beijing, if I remember correctly, in 2011 or 2012, and it was the initiative of Justin Lin and the dean of the International Studies Department at Beida, at Peking University, who were concerned about the growing difficulty of the United States in the South China Sea and Southeast Asia, and felt that it would be better for China to look north and northwest. And later Xi Jinping adopts the idea. I think that the reason why Belt and Road is so expensive, and I mean, it's on a completely different scale to Marshall Aid. Marshall Aid was just for Europe. It was not more than Europe. It was designed to revive Western Europe in particular, up to the Iron Curtain as it was, as largely a geopolitical project with extremely important economic consequences, as we've seen in European development subsequently. Whereas Belt and Road is on a totally different scale. I mean, Belt and Road has the objective of transforming and extremely underdeveloped, largely landmass called Eurasia. And that is a
Is that the objective of the Belt and Road, or is the objective of the Belt and Road also for China meant to be financial?
Of course it has a project of that kind has multiple objectives. It's not just one objective. But I think that this attempt, often lots of things are projected onto it, and I agree with the point that was made earlier in relationship to this. I think it was Yuan's point, which is, what's the great master plan? Well, I think to some extent this is the way they've done it is actually very typical of reform and opening up domestically, which is they don't start with a great, huge plan. They start with a big idea, and they develop that idea in a very pragmatic way over time. And I think Belt and Road will evolve in the same way, because, it's too big to, however big your computer is, you're never going to work out all the possibilities and all. The other thing I want to say is this, in relation to the question, and that is, I think the best solution to the future is cooperation between the United States and China. This is absolutely critical. If it doesn't happen, then both will suffer. But I would suggest that America will be a bigger casualty than China. Because China is a growing, developing, expanding, as we saw from Professor Yip's talk, increasingly innovative and dynamic economy. And let's be blunt about it, and I said this to you, and I said this to you yesterday, America is in decline. And so its ability to handle these kind of problems politically and in terms of flexibility and so on is much less. So hopefully we can find full-scale collaboration between the United States and China in a whole number of different fields. But at the moment, the prospects for that are declining and diminishing. But hopefully that will not continue.
I want to go to another question, but does anyone want to respond to that? It looked like you wanted to respond.
Just on this decline point, I think it's important not to blame China or anybody else for this so-called American decline. I wrote a piece about it earlier, arguing that the right way to respond to the rise of China is to have another large-scale investment in science and technology in this country, right? But this is not what the U.S. Congress is doing. They are cutting the research spending on science and technology. They are restricting various ways scientists can work, right? So in many ways, China is moving ahead in science and technology. George shows really, impressively what they have done. It's on the back of large-scale funding. Science is very costly, right? So there's no escape from that. You need to spend money on science. You need to give scientists more freedom. And in China, even though academic freedom in social science is non-existent, it's probably negative, but in science, they have lots of freedom. Look at the CRISPR baby, or the babies, right? There was a twin sisters, and the Chinese scientists genetically re-engineered the twin sisters, right? There's no way you can do that in the United States.
There are questions about that CRISPR too, but we can put a peg in that for further. I think we have a question from one of our remote locations. So Scott Peterson of Lincoln Academy is saying from Rockland, can we expect intellectual property theft to diminish as innovation increases? George Yip.
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, in 2017, more Chinese companies sued other Chinese companies on intellectual property infringement than Western companies sued Chinese companies. So now they have a lot of IPR to protect, and the Chinese government is investing in more and more IPR courts. So give them some time. I think we heard yesterday perhaps also that every rising country has stolen intellectual property. Germany stole intellectual property. In fact, the label made in Germany was created by Britain in order to designate inferior products that were stealing British technology. There was once a Japanese town called Yusa that put in the label made in USA, so it seemed to be better. They don't do that anymore. So yes, it's definitely going to go. It's definitely going to go down. And I do, and I do have to say that the Trump administration, by pushing on this issue of intellectual property, is doing the right thing in this particular case. And an example of what Yasheng says, as something specific, which is let's protect something specific, not a general China is bad, but that instances of forcing the transfer of intellectual property. It's been a classic example of the prisoner's dilemma, right? Which is that China has picked off individual Western companies, one, if you don't transfer intellectual property, we won't give you access to the market. And two, if you don't do it, we're going to go to the next company who's going to do it. But this will diminish, but it does need a concerted effort by the United States and the European Union to put pressure on China about that.
We have a question up here in the balcony.
Vaidehi Roy from Calcutta, India, University of Maine, Orono, School of Policy and International Affairs. So my question is to Dr. Ang. My question is, why are there so few women in the top leadership in China compared to many other developing countries in the world? And how do you see that impacting, if at all, China's future? Thank you.
Great question.
Wow, it is a great question. I have not studied that specifically, but I think you're absolutely right to observe that China's bureaucracy, its political leadership is highly male dominant. In my experience, I have sometimes encountered a few female leaders, but this is indeed very rare. I think there are multiple obstacles in China for women to advance in politics and bureaucracy. I think, first of all, there is generally gender inequity in China. That's just one basic factor. The other factor is that life as a bureaucrat, a civil servant, as a leader in China is an extremely high-stress job. You basically have no work-life balance. Speaking of work-life balance, it's even worse for a government official. And I encourage you, for example, to see a couple of documentaries. One of them I mentioned in my talk called The Party Secretary, where there was this Chinese documentary filmmaker who followed the party secretary all day long for a whole year. And basically you find that he just works all the time, and his entertainment and his work becomes inseparable. A lot of bureaucratic life involves entertainment, heavy drinking, and so forth. And so this environment, it's very difficult for women to penetrate.
That sounds like politics in general in almost every
that's
country.
True. That
Not
is true.
necessarily
that
the
is
heavy
true.
drinking, but certainly that. Yes, we have a question right here.
Good morning. My name is Greg Johnson from Harpswell, Maine. And one could argue that one of the most unfortunate decisions the U.S. government has ever made to withdraw from the TPP.
No.
And to the panel in general, how does that facilitate the Chinese aspirations for hegemony over, particularly in the Pacific Rim, but even beyond the Pacific Rim?
So for those listeners who don't know, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a multilateral trade deal under the Obama administration that had been negotiated, and it was a way for the United States to try to lead Asian trade with its own rules of the road. And the Trump administration after that had been agreed to pulled out of the TPP. So who would like to comment on whether this allows China its own straight road to dominate the rules of the road in Asian trade or Pacific trade? Yasheng?
Yeah. So one, I often talk about things I know nothing about, but so
You teach at a business school. You better know about this.
So I won't make an exception in this case. I actually had troubles with the way TPP was constructed. Because TPP specifies a number of criteria and labor rights and labor treatment conditions and all of that. TPP actually included countries in Asia that had inferior compliance with those provisions as compared with China, right? So it was viewed as a political instrument to contain China rather than on the basis of merit. So that aside, I do agree with the direction of the question, which is that you need an international arrangement that promotes standards, labor standards, environmental standards, and things like that, And then sort of dangle the membership in front of countries such as China to comply even more. By undermining that TPP, Trump administration is pushing other Asian countries to foster and develop closer economic ties with China, right? Rather than having the United States as the major sort of shaper and definer of this important institution. Martin yesterday talked about the U.S. stupid decision not to join the AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, because U.S. lost the opportunity to shape the rules of the game rather than they stood aside rather than participating in the rule writing and rule of the game influence. And that was bad for the United States because U.S. lost the credibility, because U.S. not only refused to join, they told other countries not to join, and those other countries joined, right? Because
those other countries, sorry?
They decided to join AIIB. U.S. told South Korea not to join. U.S. told Britain not to join. Both of them joined.
So Britain joined?
Yeah, they joined. and this is really, really, really bad because you lost leverage over the institution as well as losing the leverage over these other countries. I think it's very important for the U.S. to participate. I believe there are genuine, legitimate issues between China and the United States. But I believe...
Over trade, you mean?
Over trade, a host of other issues. I mean, not just trade. But I believe the right way to participate, a right way to deal with these issues is to participate, to be an active participant in defining the rules of the game, and to engage conversations and dialogues. And occasionally you use the stick here and there, right? But that's not the current approach.
Yes.
So I agree with what Yoshin says, but I just wanted to add. I mean, I didn't like TPP for the same reasons as you. It was clearly an attempt to exclude China. I think an attempt to exclude China in terms of East Asian and Asia-Pacific trade is deeply problematic because China is easily the biggest trader, and has been and is now, in those terms, easily the biggest economic player in the region. So I was skeptical about where it would go. In fact, the situation now is that the only show in town is the RCEP, which embraces a lot more countries than TPP now, or as previously envisaged. And I mean, this is a different kind of economic agreement. It's less advanced, but it's more inclusive. And of course, China is a big player in this. Not the only player, because the ASEAN countries are big players in terms of the RCEP. And now the Chinese, as you probably know, are proposing something on a bigger scale now alongside this, which is basically an Asia-Pacific free trade agreement. The Chinese are very interested in this kind of thing. We've seen this over a long period now. And it goes back really to the turn of the century and the first agreement between China and ASEAN, ASEAN +1, and everything has grown basically since then. I think it's extremely important America's involved in these kind of things. I think it should be involved in RCEP. If it's not involved in TPP, it should be involved in RCEP. In fact, I think it should always be involved in RCEP as well as in TPP, because the way to develop these trading agreements and be part of them is to have a stake in as many as you can, as is necessary at that time.
All right. Well, we are out of time for questions this morning. I want to let everyone know that maps and lists of restaurants in Camden and Rockland are available in your registration areas. Please be back in your seats by 1:30. We're going to open the afternoon session promptly, and please join me in thanking our morning speakers.